The Christmas lights shimmered with a soft glow, reflecting in the glass of sparkling wine. The air was filled with the scent of cinnamon, fir branches, and warm pastries, mingling with the hum of voices and bursts of laughter. Jessica's party was everything a pre-Christmas gathering should be: cozy, noisy, and full of life. It seemed like everyone I knew was there, but even amidst this chaos, I felt surprisingly alone. Standing by the window, I gazed out at the snow-covered yard, where the faint glow of Christmas lights hung from the trees. My reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, distant as though it wasn't really me. I sighed, trying to shake off the strange feeling when I felt someone approach me from behind. "We need to talk, Lindsay," came the familiar voice. James. His tone was tense, as if he already knew that our conversation wouldn't lead to anything good. I turned, and his face immediately confirmed my fears. The cold stare, the tightly pressed lips. It was all too familiar. We'd been arguing so often lately that I'd almost grown accustomed to that expression. But today was different. His words, spoken quietly yet confidently, hit the very core of my unease. "You always avoid the conversation as soon as something's off," he said. "Do you even care about what's going on between us?" I opened my mouth to respond, but froze. I had no answer. Probably because I didn't know the answer myself. "James, not now." I wearily ran a hand through my hair and turned back to the window. "This isn't the place for these kinds of talks." "Of course, you always say that," he muttered with sarcasm, but added nothing more. I felt him waiting for an answer, but my thoughts drifted far away. After a few seconds, James left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I felt empty. Amidst the general merrymaking, I couldn't find my place. With some awkward excuse, I threw on my coat and stepped outside. The snow crunched underfoot, the cold nipped at my cheeks. It was quiet here, with only faint music playing from the house. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, when suddenly I heard a voice. "Lindsay? Is that really you?" I turned around. On the path lit by garlands stood Adam. His figure was unexpectedly familiar, yet almost forgotten. I blinked several times, not believing my eyes. We hadn't seen each other since he moved to New York. "Adam?" I barely managed to say. "What are you doing here?" His smile was just like it had been when we were kids, open and slightly teasing. "I decided to come home for the holidays. Never thought I'd run into you here." We started talking as though those years apart had never happened. He told me about life in New York, work, the constant rush, the noisy streets. And I laughed, listening to his stories, remembering what he was like when we were children. His voice reminded me of a time when things were simpler, when the world seemed smaller yet warmer. And despite the cold, for the first time that evening, I felt a warmth spreading through me. "You've hardly changed at all," Adam said, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his coat. His voice was casual, but in his eyes I noticed something more: genuine joy at seeing me. Still as serious, a bit thoughtful. But I suppose New York has blurred my vision a little. I smiled, feeling the ice inside me begin to melt after weeks of accumulating coldness. "Well, you know, people don't change that much. They just add more masks," I replied, glancing momentarily at my boots sinking into the snow. "And you? How's New York? Still blinding with its lights?" Adam hummed, as if I'd said something funny. "New York is chaos, a constant race. At first it's thrilling, then it's exhausting, and eventually you realize you're just running, not knowing where or why. Sometimes you want—" He paused as though pondering whether he should continue. "Sometimes you want something real, like moments like this." I noticed a snowflake softly land on his shoulder, but he didn't even acknowledge it. In that moment, Adam looked completely different from the way I remembered him. Not as my stepbrother, who always teased me at Christmas, but as someone who was genuinely tired. His confident mask seemed to have cracked. "Adam," I said quietly, trying to make my words sound warm. "But you have everything. A job, prospects, dreams. Didn't you always want that?" He looked at me, and in his eyes something completely unfamiliar appeared. Not sadness, but rather some kind of inner struggle. Maybe I wanted that once. But now, I feel like something's missing. And it's more than just a career or money. His words hung in the air like snowflakes slowly falling to the ground. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, letting him know I was listening. Adam had always been something of a mystery to me, even when we were kids. Always confident, a bit cheeky, he never showed his weaknesses. And now, here he stood before me, like someone who had finally decided to take off a heavy burden. "And you?" he suddenly asked, looking me straight in the eyes. "Are you happy, Lindsay?" I froze. His question took me by surprise, and my heart wavered. Am I happy? Had I even thought about it recently? James, work, endless little things. Suddenly, all of it seemed so empty. In that moment, I realized that the honest answer wasn't so simple to find. "I don't know," I said at last. Honestly, sometimes it feels like I'm just going through the motions. We fell silent. The snowflakes continued to swirl in the air, and somewhere beyond the trees, the windows of the house glowed with laughter and music spilling out. But this moment, just the two of us surrounded by winter silence, was completely different. "Lindsay," he said softly, "you've always been honest with yourself. If something's wrong, you feel it. Don't pretend everything's okay if it's not." I nodded, not knowing how to respond. His words seemed to have penetrated deeper than I had expected. In that moment, I remembered how, when we were children, Adam used to cheer me up when it felt like everything was going wrong. Back then, I believed him. And now, I wanted to believe again. When we returned to the house, the noise of the party immediately swept over us, like a wave. Jessica approached me with a glass in hand, smiling, but I could no longer fully immerse myself in the festive chaos. A quiet, yet piercing thought lingered in my mind. Perhaps everything I knew about myself and my life was about to change. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The apartment was cold, but I still forced myself to get up. Today, I needed to go to my parents' house to help them prepare for Christmas. It had become something of a family ritual. Every year, we decorated the house together, prepared dinner, and took out the old decorations from the attic that had been around since my childhood. As I drove along the snow-covered road, my thoughts kept drifting back to my conversation with Adam. His words wouldn't leave my mind. The last time I visited my parents, we barely spoke. At the time, I didn't even consider that he might be feeling lonely in such a big city. I felt a bit ashamed of my indifference. My parents' house looked as cozy as ever. The porch was already lined with glowing lanterns, and the smell of fresh-baked goods wafted out from inside. Mom greeted me at the door, her apron dusted with flour and a warm smile on her face. "Lindsay, it's so great that you came early. We have so much to do." She immediately started telling me what still needed to be done. I helped her move some boxes with decorations aside, then went to find Dad. He was in the living room, hanging up garlands on the walls, quietly humming to himself. "Hey, Dad," I said, giving him a hug. "Hey, sweetheart," he replied with a smile. "Got a free hand? We need to attach another garland, or I'm afraid without you, it'll all come crashing down." We worked together, and I could feel the tension of the past few days slowly melting away. I've always loved coming back here, to this house that held so many memories. Everything seemed simpler here, like time slowed down. And then Adam appeared in the doorway. His unexpected presence caught me off guard. He was holding a box of tree ornaments, and his face wore the familiar, slightly ironic smile. "Need help?" he asked, scanning the room. "Adam?" Mom said in surprise, peeking out from the kitchen. "You said you'd be at your friend's." "I changed my mind." He shrugged. "Decided to spend the day with you guys." Mom looked pleasantly surprised, but there was something in her gaze that made me pause. She was watching us, me and Adam, as if trying to solve some puzzle. I tried to ignore it and went back to hanging up the garlands. Adam and I worked side by side, just like old times. He told me about how one of his coworkers had tried to decorate the office with paper snowflakes, but they ended up being accidentally thrown away with the shredding paper. I laughed, picturing the scene. It reminded me of our childhood days when we'd race to decorate the house and tease each other. Remember that time you hung a candy on the tree and then ate it yourself? He asked, winking at me. And do you remember when you hung the garland upside down and blamed me for it? I replied, laughing. Our jokes and laughter seemed to fill the house. Even Dad stopped what he was doing to watch us with a smile. But when I turned around, I noticed that Mom was looking at us a bit differently. Her warm eyes were focused, almost cautious, as if she were trying to understand what was going on. These looks made me feel a little uneasy, but at the same time I realized something was changing between me and Adam. We weren't just laughing like we used to. There was a new depth to our conversations, something we both seemed afraid to name. By evening, the house was filled with the scent of tangerines, cinnamon, and pine resin. Mom and I had finished hanging the decorations, Dad was preparing dinner, and Adam had disappeared somewhere, promising to return in a couple of hours. I took advantage of the moment to rest for a bit and stepped out onto the terrace with a cup of tea. The fresh, frosty air was invigorating, and for a moment, I felt my thoughts clear. But that peace didn't last long. My phone vibrated in my pocket. James. I froze, staring at the screen. A part of me wanted to ignore the call, but something inside urged me to do the opposite. I pressed the button, and his voice immediately filled the speaker. Hey, Lindsay, how are you? His tone was unusually soft, almost cautious. Hey, I replied, trying to sound steady. I'm fine. How about you? Not bad. I just wanted to talk. James paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and about how things just don't feel right. I stayed silent, watching the snowflakes fall onto the railing of the terrace. His voice was calm, but I could sense something more beneath it. Tension, regret, maybe even resentment. Lindsay, I don't want us to keep going like this. It's silly. We can fix it if we both want to. Don't you think? He continued, pausing to hear my response. His words made sense, but something inside me wouldn't allow me to agree. There was no sincerity or warmth in our conversation, only another attempt to solve the problem without getting to the heart of it. I had felt it before, but now it was clear. James, I don't know, I finally said. It feels like we're always talking, but we're not really listening. He fell silent. The snowflakes continued to fall, filling the space between us with silence. Maybe I'm to blame, he said at last. Maybe I pushed too hard, or maybe I'm not trying enough. But I want us to make it work. I'm willing to work on it. What about you? I wanted to answer immediately, but I couldn't. Instead, I slowly breathed in the frosty air. Adam's question from yesterday suddenly resurfaced in my mind. Are you happy? I'm not sure, I said softly, barely recognizing my own voice. I need time to figure that out. Time, James repeated, and there was a hint of bitterness in his tone. All right, I'll give you that time. But just tell me, Lindsay, do you even want to be with me? Or am I just wasting my time? At that moment, I realized that our relationship had reached a dead end, and it wasn't just because of the small arguments. We had both changed, but instead of growing together, we had started to drift apart. I couldn't give him an answer because I didn't know what I wanted either. James, I can't talk about this right now, I said, trying not to sound rude. Let's leave this until after the holidays. As you wish, he replied curtly. Call me when you're ready to talk. The call ended, leaving me with a sense of emptiness. I set my phone down on the railing and leaned against it, staring at the forest stretching into the distance. Everything that had once seemed solid and dependable suddenly felt fragile, like freshly fallen snow. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Adam. He was standing in the doorway of the terrace, holding a cup with something hot in it. Everything okay? He asked, and there was care in his voice. Yeah, just a call, I replied, shrugging. Adam didn't say anything else. He simply walked closer and handed me the cup. It's cocoa, he said with a slight smile. You look like you could use it. I took the cup, feeling the warmth of his gaze. We stood silently on the terrace, looking at the snowy forest. I didn't need to explain anything. Adam, as always, understood without words. Later that evening, Adam suggested we go for a walk. The house was overflowing with the scent of the festive dinner, the cheerful voices of my parents, and the cozy bustle of preparation. I felt like I was wrapped in a warm cocoon, but something inside still called me outside. So, when he suggested stepping out, I agreed immediately. We walked down the path leading to an old bridge not far from the house. This bridge had been part of our childhood. We used to play here often, throwing stones into the water, dreaming about the future and coming up with crazy plans. Adam walked beside me, head lowered, as if contemplating how to start the conversation. I didn't rush him, enjoying the quiet crunch of snow underfoot and the stillness of the winter forest. Lindsay, he finally began, looking straight ahead. Have you ever felt like you're doing everything right, but something is still missing? His question caught me off guard. It sounded so familiar. It made something inside me tighten. Yes, I answered after a short pause. The last few months, it's like I've been living someone else's life. You know, like I'm not making the decisions, but circumstances are making them for me. He nodded, as if he understood exactly what I meant. It's the same for me, he said. He paused for a moment, then continued. In New York, I tried to be someone I thought I was supposed to be. Work longer than everyone, be successful, achieve something, but I don't know. It doesn't bring me joy. I'm just tired. I looked at him, surprised at how open he was being. Adam had never talked about his feelings so frankly. He had always been the one to joke, distract everyone from problems, and create the illusion of ease. But now his words felt like a confession. Why didn't you say anything before? I asked quietly. He smiled, but there was more sadness than joy in it. Because it's hard to admit you're unhappy when everyone thinks your life is perfect. It feels like letting them down. I nodded, feeling how his words resonated within me. It was so similar to what I was going through. I, too, had been afraid to disappoint James, my parents, even myself. Afraid to admit that I had long lost my way in this race for the right life. And now you're back here to change something? I asked, looking him in the face. I don't know why I came back, he answered honestly. Maybe I just wanted to remember what it feels like to be myself. Everything here feels so real. Even you. You're so different from the way you were yesterday at the party. His words touched me, but not in a bad way. It was more like a wake-up call. I looked at the old bridge, the trees covered in frost, and suddenly realized that here, beside Adam, it was easier to breathe. I'm just tired of pretending, I admitted, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. With James, with work, even with myself. All of it. Seems right on the outside, but inside there's nothing left. We stopped in the middle of the bridge. Adam turned toward me, and in his gaze I saw the same sincerity that had always drawn me to him as a child. He didn't judge, didn't offer advice. He simply listened. Do you know what the hardest part is? He said. It's admitting that you deserve something else. You deserve to be happy, even if it means changing something. His words were quiet, but they held a strength that echoed in my soul. I felt tears well up in my eyes, but I held them back, exhaling a cloud of vapor into the cold air. Thank you, Adam, I whispered. Thank you for reminding me of that. We stood on the bridge for a long time, while the snow slowly covered our footprints on the path. In that moment, I realized that this conversation was more important to me than I could have ever imagined. The next morning, Mom decided to bring out the old photo albums. The whole family gathered in the living room. Adam and I sat together, flipping through the pages, each one covered with memories. Do you remember this? Mom showed a photo of us making paper reindeer. You two fought so much back then, I thought the tree would be left without decorations. Adam laughed. Because Lindsay always wanted to do everything perfectly, and I just glued things on, however. I snorted, but smiled. Because someone was too lazy to try hard. Everyone laughed, but then Adam handed me one of the photos. In it, we were sitting under the Christmas tree, smiling happily. We really believed that everything was ahead of us, he said softly. His words lingered in my mind. The photo reminded me of how easy it was to dream when everything seemed possible. In the evening, when everyone had gathered at the table, the sound of the doorbell rang through the house. Mom looked at us in surprise, and I got up to answer. Standing on the doorstep was James, holding a bouquet of white lilies. His unexpected appearance caught me off guard. "Hi," he said with a guilty smile. I thought I should apologize in person. Mom immediately invited him inside, and I, though hesitant, followed them. My parents were as warm and welcoming as always, but I felt out of place. We spoke in the kitchen while the others were in the living room. James looked sincere, but his words still didn't reach my heart. "I just want us to be closer again," he said. "Maybe we could go somewhere after the holidays? We need some time together." I nodded, but inside I was full of doubts. His presence only strengthened the feeling that we were trying to patch something that had already cracked too deeply. The next day, Adam suggested we take another walk. He said he needed to get away from the chaos of the house for a little while. I agreed, as I too felt the need to escape from everything that had been weighing on me in recent days. We walked along a forest path, sinking into the snow that crunched underfoot. The silence around us was almost tangible, only occasionally interrupted by the sound of the wind or the cracking of a branch. Adam walked just ahead, occasionally turning to make sure I wasn't falling behind. "This forest has always been something special to me." He finally broke the silence. "It was a place where I could hide from everything." "You used to come here when we fought," I said, smiling slightly. "And you always found me," he replied, glancing back at me. "You were the only one who knew where to look." His words carried a light sadness, but at the same time, there was warmth in them. We reached a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. It seemed almost magical. The snow sparkled in the sunlight, and everything around us looked like it had stepped out of a winter fairy tale. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" he said, sitting down on a large fallen tree trunk. I sat beside him, and for a few minutes we remained silent. Finally, he spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about why I came back here. At first, I thought it was just to get away from everything. But now, I realize that's not the whole truth." I looked at him, trying to understand what he was getting at. His face was serious, and I could sense that he was carefully choosing his words. "I came back because I missed home. I missed this place, my parents. And I missed you, Lindsay," he said, looking into my eyes. "To be honest, I've been feeling for a while like I've lost part of myself. But here, with you, I feel like I can find it again." His words took me completely by surprise. I stared at him, trying to comprehend how deeply he had opened up. Adam had never been one to speak about his feelings, and now he was saying all of this so calmly, so sincerely. "Adam, I don't even know what to say," I admitted, feeling a tightness in my chest. He smiled as though he understood my confusion. "You don't need to say anything. Just think about it, Lindsay. Sometimes the most important things seem complicated, but that doesn't mean they're wrong." We spent a little more time in the forest, reminiscing about our childhood, sharing our fears and dreams. Adam told me about how, despite the crowds of people in New York, he felt incredibly lonely. I, in turn, shared my doubts about James and my life in general. When we returned home, my mind was in chaos. Adam's words wouldn't leave me. His sincerity was something I had been missing in recent years. And though I tried not to think too deeply about it, I knew inside that this conversation had changed a lot. That evening at the family dinner, the familiar holiday atmosphere filled the house. Mom served the main course, Dad told funny stories from his childhood, and we all laughed. Adam sat beside me, occasionally flashing me smiles that made me feel a strange warmth inside. But as soon as Dad raised another toast, he glanced at Adam and me and unexpectedly said, "You two are always together, just like when you were kids. It's hard to believe so many years have passed." The joke caused everyone to laugh, but I felt my cheeks flush. Mom looked at me with a faint smile, and I could sense a hidden question in her gaze. After dinner, when everyone started to head out, Mom quietly approached me in the kitchen, where I was cleaning up the dishes. "Lindsay," she began, her voice soft yet serious. "You look different. Is everything okay?" "Of course, Mom, everything's fine," I hurriedly responded, but her gaze didn't let me go. "I can see the way you look at Adam," she said, staring me straight in the eyes. "And the way he looks at you? Is it something more than just sibling affection?" I felt a lump form in my throat. Though I had been trying to ignore it, her words voiced what I had been afraid to admit to myself. My heart suddenly raced, and I turned toward the sink. "Mom, we just talk a lot," I finally said, not knowing what else to say. "Lindsay." She came closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I'm not judging. I just want you to understand what's happening. Don't hide your feelings, either from yourself or from others." I nodded silently, feeling her words touch something fragile inside me. When she left the kitchen, I stood still, holding the towel in my hands. At that moment, I realized that all this time, I had been running away from the truth. Adam had become more to me than just a stepbrother. But what did that mean? What was I supposed to do with this realization? My heart and mind were at odds with each other as I stood in the quiet of the kitchen. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. I knew that ahead of me lay a moment when I would have to make a choice. And that choice would change everything. The next morning, during breakfast, I noticed that Adam was unusually quiet. He was avoiding eye contact with me and clearly deep in thought. My parents had gone into the next room, leaving us alone. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Adam looked up, and in his eyes, I saw something like fatigue and determination. "Lindsay," he began after a brief pause, "I've been thinking all night, and I've decided that I'm going back to New York right after the holidays." His words hit me like a blow. "Why?" I asked, trying not to let my feelings show. "You said you wanted to rest, figure things out." "I thought I could find answers here," he confessed. "But it seems like I need to leave the past behind. Sometimes going back to where you felt good doesn't help. It only makes things more complicated." I felt everything inside me twist. His words affected me more than I expected. It was clear that he wasn't just talking about the house or childhood memories. He was talking about us. Adam. I tried to find the words, but they didn't come. "Are you sure this is the right decision?" He sighed and looked at me with a sad smile. "I don't know, Lindsay, but I'm afraid that if I stay here, I'll get stuck in this state of uncertainty. I don't want to ruin what we have," he said quietly. "Maybe distance is what we both need right now." I didn't know how to respond. His decision seemed final, but a part of me didn't want to accept it. Everything inside me screamed that it was wrong, that I didn't want to let him go. But I remained silent, afraid of saying something I would regret later. We both sat there in the silence, filled with words that were never spoken. For the first time, Adam seemed truly vulnerable, and it hurt me to see him that way. But his determination was stronger. "When are you leaving?" I finally found the strength to ask. "Morning after Christmas," he replied. "I've made up my mind." He stood up from the table as if he didn't want to continue the conversation. But before leaving the room, he stopped and looked at me. "Lindsay, you will always be an important part of my life, but sometimes you have to know when to let go." And with those words, he left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat at the table, feeling his words echo inside me. His decision seemed right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing something important. The morning arrived quietly and coldly. The house was immersed in a semi-dreamlike state, and only the sounds of Mom preparing coffee could be heard from the kitchen. I put on a sweater and slowly made my way downstairs. In the hallway stood Adam, ready to leave, his suitcase by the door, and he was quietly saying something to Dad. When he noticed me, his gaze lingered for a fraction of a second before he looked away. It seemed that saying goodbye was the last thing he wanted to stretch out. "Are you leaving already?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Yeah, it's time," he replied, lifting his suitcase. "The trains don't wait." Mom approached to give him a hug, and Dad patted him on the shoulder with his usual warmth. But when it was my turn, we both froze. I looked at him, not knowing how to express everything I wanted to say before time ran out. "Adam," I started, feeling the lump rise in my throat. "Thank you for these days, and for everything you said." He nodded as though he understood what I meant. "Take care of yourself, Lindsay," he said. "You deserve to be happy." I wanted to say something more, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I hugged him, tighter than usual, hoping he would feel everything I couldn't express. His arms gently wrapped around me in return, and in that moment, the world seemed to stop. But it all ended as quickly as it had begun. Adam let go of me, grabbed his suitcase, and stepped toward the door. "Goodbye," he said, glancing back with a slight smile, and walked out into the snow. I stood by the window, watching his car disappear around a snowy bend. This moment felt like the end of an entire chapter, like the full stop in a story that would never be the same again. The rest of the holidays passed quietly. My parents tried to keep up the usual routine, but I could see that they noticed the changes in me. I tried not to think about what could have been, but his words kept echoing in my mind. "You deserve to be happy." In the days that followed, I reflected on a lot. It was as though his departure had given me the chance to see my life differently. I didn't know where this path would lead me, but one thing was certain. I couldn't keep living the way I had before. Perhaps I didn't know how to fix everything, but I was ready to try.